Jim Morrison, the enigmatic frontman of The Doors, is remembered as one of rock's most iconic and rebellious figures. His voice, lyrics, and stage presence left an indelible mark on the 1960s counterculture, and his untimely death at 27 only added to the legend. Known for his poetic lyrics, wild charisma, and fearless experimentation, Morrison seemed to embody the spirit of rock and roll itself. Fans idolized him, but few knew about the personal opinions he held about his contemporaries in music. Despite being at the center of one of rock's most revolutionary bands, Morrison was notoriously critical of other musicians and bands. He didn't shy away from expressing his disdain for artists he felt lacked authenticity, creativity, or soul. While many admired his genius on stage, Morrison privately maintained a list of bands he outright hated, sometimes mocking their music, their image, or the culture surrounding them. These weren't just casual critiques. They were intense judgments from a man who valued artistic integrity above all else. Morrison's opinions reveal a side of him rarely seen by fans, the side that was analytical, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically honest about the music world around him. Some of the bands he despised were contemporaries, while others represented trends he felt were shallow, commercial, or creatively bankrupt. For anyone who thought Jim Morrison only lived in poetry, mystique, and on-stage chaos, the truth is far more surprising. The list of bands he hated not only sheds light on his personal tastes but also offers insight into his uncompromising philosophy about music, art, and authenticity. By exploring these 6 bands, we gain a glimpse into the mind of rock's most mercurial poet and understand why his Jim Morrison, the legendary lead singer of The Doors, was more than just a frontman. He was the philosophical, poetic, and often unpredictable force that defined a generation of rock music. Born on December 8, 1943, in Melbourne, Florida, Morrison's early fascination with literature, poetry, and the existential questions of life shaped both his artistic vision and his worldview. By the time The Doors emerged in the mid-1960s, Morrison had already cultivated a keen sense of what he believed music should be: raw, authentic, and challenging to the status quo. This perspective didn't just inform The Doors' sound, it also shaped Morrison's judgment of other artists. While some rock musicians thrived on popularity, showmanship, or commercial appeal, Morrison sought depth, meaning, and intensity in music. He admired artists who were willing to take risks, push boundaries, and reveal something profoundly human through their work. Conversely, he had little patience for bands he considered superficial, derivative, or overly commercialized. These opinions were often private, shared only with close friends and bandmates, but they reflected Morrison's uncompromising standards for art. Morrison's disdain for certain bands often s. Morrison's judgments weren't always personal attacks, they were reflections of his own uncompromising artistic philosophy. Bands that focused solely on image, gimmicks, or commercial success instead of genuine expression often found themselves on his blacklist. This uncompromising attitude sometimes alienated others, but it also defined Morrison as a figure who refused to compromise his values, even in a culture obsessed with celebrity. In this chapter, we begin to explore the first of the 6 bands Jim Morrison openly or privately expressed disdain for, starting with those who, in his eyes, epitomized the commercialization and creative stagnation he despised. Understanding Morrison's standards helps explain not only why he disliked certain bands, but also why The Doors' music remains timeless. It was a rebellion against the superficiality he saw all around him. Judgment mattered, both then and now. Jim Morrison was never shy about his opinions when it came to music. While he respected genuine artistry, he had little tolerance for bands he felt were overly commercial, derivative, or shallow. Among the first on his private list of disdain were bands that epitomized everything he opposed in the rock scene of the 1960s and 1970s. One of the earliest targets of Morrison's criticism was the Monkees. Although wildly popular and adored by the public, Morrison saw them as emblematic of a manufactured music industry. The Monkees were, in his view, more a product than a band, a TV-created sensation designed for mass consumption. Morrison, who believed deeply in authenticity and artistic integrity, found the idea of a band assembled by producers to sing pre-written songs insulting. He reportedly called their music soulless and resented the way they were marketed as rebellious when, in reality, their image and sound were carefully controlled. To Morrison, the Monkees represented the antithesis of the raw, poetic energy he and the Doors strived to create on stage and in the studio. Another group that drew Morrison's ire was the Bee Gees. Known for their harmonies and later their disco dominance, the Bee Gees were a band whose style Morrison considered overly polished and commercial. While their technical skill was undeniable, Morrison felt their music lacked emotional honesty and depth. The glossy, calculated nature of their hits clashed with his idea of what music should do. He believed songs should convey vulnerability, existential questioning, and real human experience, not just a catchy beat engineered to climb the charts. To him, the Bee Gees embodied the kind of superficiality that he spent his career fighting against, and their dominance in pop culture was something he quietly resented. Morrison's disdain wasn't limited to just the sounds or images these bands projected. It was also about what they represented culturally. The Monkees and the Bee Gees were symbols of an industry increasingly focused on image, formula, and commercial gain, rather than. These criticisms reveal Morrison's uncompromising philosophy. He demanded honesty from musicians and authenticity in artistic expression. Bands like the Monkees and the Bee Gees, for all their success, failed to meet that standard. Their inclusion on his list wasn't personal in the traditional sense, it was about integrity. Morrison's hatred, or at least disdain, was rooted in a deep reverence for what music could achieve when it was raw, poetic, and fearless. As we continue exploring the remaining bands Morrison despised, it becomes clear that his judgments were consistent. He disliked what he saw as imitation, commercialization, and lack of soul. His list, though controversial, offers a window into the mind of one of rock's most complex and passionate figures, revealing a man who lived for music that challenged, provoked, and endured. Jim Morrison's disdain for certain bands wasn't just about musical style, it was about authenticity, artistic risk, and the soul behind the sound. As the Doors rose to fame, Morrison grew increasingly frustrated with what he considered the commercialization and shallowness of much of the rock industry. Beyond the Monkees and the Bee Gees, there were other groups that elicited a particularly sharp response from him, reflecting both his high standards and his uncompromising philosophy about music. One band that Morrison reportedly could not stand was the Beach Boys. While their sunny harmonies and surf rock anthems were beloved by millions, Morrison saw them as emblematic of a sanitized, formulaic approach to music. To him, the Beach Boys' tracks, though technically impressive, lacked the rawness and existential weight that he valued. Morrison believed music should be a reflection of life's intensity, its struggles, and its contradictions. In contrast, the Beach Boys' carefree lyrics about cars, girls, and beach parties seemed trivial, almost insulting, to a man who infused his own songs with poetry, myth, and a darker reflection of the human experience. While he acknowledged their skill as musicians, Morrison dismissed the culture surrounding them as shallow and insipid. Another band that Morrison openly criticized was the Rolling Stones, but not in the way most fans would expect. While he admired certain elements of their music, he disliked the self-indulgent attitude he perceived in their later work and public persona. Morrison often remarked that the Stones had once been daring and dangerous, but by the mid-1970s, he felt they had become a caricature of themselves, focused more on excess and fame than on musical exploration. In Morrison's eyes, the Stones' transition from provocative innovators to rock and roll celebrities symbolized the very problem he saw in the industry. Art being sacrificed for image and spectacle. Morrison's disdain for these bands was often expressed privately with close friends or fellow musicians. He rarely launched public attacks, preferring instead to voice his frustrations in candid C. It wasn't just about style or genre, Morrison's judgments were philosophical. He hated bands that played it safe, that chased trends, or that pandered to mass audiences without taking risks. To him, music was sacred, almost spiritual, and should elevate both the listener and the performer. Anything less was disappointing, even frustrating. This perspective explains why some of the most commercially successful bands of the era found themselves on his private blacklist. Moreover, Morrison's critiques reveal his complex relationship with fame. While the Doors were commercially successful, Morrison's own celebrity often felt like a burden. He resented the idea of being compared to artists who had achieved popularity without pushing boundaries or innovating creatively. In a sense, his disdain for certain bands was also a reflection of his own frustrations with the music industry, a world that often rewarded conformity over courage. By the mid-1970s, Morrison's judgments had become almost legendary among those who knew him. While his public persona was charismatic, reckless, and enigmatic, his private conversations revealed a man deeply committed to artistic integrity and brutally honest in his evaluations of others. The Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones, in his eyes, represented a failure to remain true to the transformative potential of rock music. As we approach the final chapter, it becomes clear that Morrison's hate list was less about pettiness and more about principle. His disdain for certain bands reflects his uncompromising philosophy that music must challenge, provoke, and elevate, or else it risks becoming meaningless. The last two bands on this infamous list would push this philosophy even further, highlighting Morrison's uncompromising standards and the intensity of his convictions. As Jim Morrison grew into his role as one of rock music's most influential figures, his opinions about other bands became increasingly firm and uncompromising. While he respected true artistry, he had no tolerance for groups he considered fake, formulaic, or soulless. The final two bands on his infamous hate list perfectly illustrate his philosophy. Morrison's disdain wasn't born of jealousy or spite, it came from a deep reverence for music as a form of truth and expression. One band that Morrison openly criticized was the Doors' contemporary, Jefferson Airplane. On paper, Jefferson Airplane was emblematic of the counterculture, psychedelic, experimental, and anti-establishment. But Morrison's issue wasn't with their sound, it was with what he perceived as a lack of authenticity beneath the surface. He reportedly saw the band as theatrical, more interested in creating a spectacle than in delivering genuine artistic insight. Morrison, whose performances with the Doors were intense, immersive, and deeply personal, found Jefferson Airplane's approach superficial in comparison. He believed their popularity often relied on theatrics and imagery rather than raw emotional honesty, which clashed with his own ethos of music as an unfiltered reflection of the human soul. The final band that Morrison reportedly hated the most was arguably the most controversial, the Eagles. Known for their smooth harmonies and radio-friendly rock, the Eagles represented everything Morrison despised about commercialized music. While undeniably talented, Morrison felt that their work was safe, calculated, and devoid of risk. He viewed their enormous commercial success as proof that the music industry rewarded mediocrity over daring creativity. To Morrison, the Eagles symbolized the decline of rock music from a rebellious, expressive art form into a commodity for mass consumption. The precision and polish that defined their sound, rather than impressing him, confirmed his belief that authenticity had been sacrificed for profit. Morrison's contempt for these bands underscores a key truth about his character: he was fiercely principled. He didn't hate these artists because of personal grudges, but because they represented trends in the industry that he believed stifled creativity and diluted the power of music. His judgment was a reflection of his own standards, his unwavering commitment to honesty, and his belief that music should challenge, provoke, and illuminate the human experience. Anything less was unworthy of admiration. Interestingly, Morrison's hate list was less about bitterness and more about advocacy for artistic integrity. His criticisms reveal a man who valued depth, risk, and emotional honesty above all else. For Morrison, rock music wasn't just entertainment, it was a medium for exploring the human condition. Bands that prioritized commercial success over sincerity, or who relied on gimmicks rather than genuine expression, were antithetical to his vision. Despite his criticisms, Morrison never attempted to destroy these bands' careers publicly. His judgments were mostly shared in private conversations, interviews, or personal writings. He understood the power of influence but refrained from using it to bully or disparage others. Instead, his disdain was a measure of his own expectations, a benchmark for the kind of artistry he believed should define the music world. Jim Morrison's legacy is often defined by his poetic lyrics, e.